that kind of table that the song speaks of, that table that God has set and invites us to as we come to God's table of love, that's the kind of table I want you to keep in mind, even in juxtaposition to the rather harsh table described in the parable that I will read now from Matthew. The parable, we've been hearing a lot of these parables. We've been reading through Matthew, through this section of Jesus sort of disrupting expectations. Jesus saying, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven is like this. And almost every one of those like this is rather like, wait, what? Because there's quite a lot of violence in the descriptions. And scholars can talk about why that is and what the disruption is. I bring this, we're going to read also the 23rd Psalm, which is quite a different feeling of a text. And I bring the Matthew story in because I think the context of our lives today, certainly in the midst of the news and what's happening in Israel and Gaza, I mean, the violence continues to be abounding and visceral. And there's not, for me, a linear, like, it's not like reading this parable then points out good or bad in a specific way, other than it brings to, it accompanies us in the reality of violence in our lives. And next to that, we will also hear the 23rd Psalm. So listen with me to this parable. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet. Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe? And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. Ay vey. The kingdom of God is like that. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to that. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to that. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to that, a king acting that way. Right? Certainly, life on Earth, on planet Earth in 2023 might be compared to that. The kingdom of heaven might be compared to that. That's a wrestle. That's a real wrestle. There is, to me, the place that I return to, the kernel, the invocation place, which is resonant with the hymn, which just says it much more beautifully, is that place of invitation, coming to the table that is set, right? Coming to the table, God's table. I'm not gonna over-piece out this parable today. I'm just gonna literally let it be here with us as ancient violence that mimics present-day violence, that God has something to do with, but not as a condoner, but that just like, there's no Pollyanna-ness in our text today, right? But I'm not gonna try to piece out where precisely is God, other than probably, to me, somewhere in our own disruptedness, our own, wait, what? Like that God is in that doesn't feel quite right. Like, yeah, I know we're in the outer darkness. There's definitely weeping and gnashing of teeth out of here. And then the question, the invocation, the prayer is, and where is God, and what do I need of God, and how does the divine move in me and through me, and what is this table to which we are called to sit around? It's an unsettling one. And next to it, and this is from the lectionary passages, so these are like the texts given to us, right, if we wish. And the psalm for this Sunday, to go along with this text, is a familiar psalm, the 23rd Psalm. Do you know this psalm? It begins, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," right? It is a very well-known text. And what we're going to do a bit today is talk about the relationship between disruption and comfort, chaos and comfort. The relationship between pain and agony and not seeing, and that feeling of gnashing and weeping, the feeling of where, oh God, are you, and where, oh God, am I? And the yearning, right, for comfort and presence and certainty and companionship, their relatedness. Okay. Sherry Mitchell is a Indigenous attorney, activist, and author from the Penobscot Nation. She's the author of a book that I've referred to before called Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change. And she writes in many places and is very active publicly. She's also the director of the Land Peace Foundation. And she's been part of a project of land reclamation in Maine for the Abenaki people. Sherry writes, and I'll return to her a couple times today, but the first part, she writes, "The question is not why we are here, but how we show up powerfully how we show up most powerfully to meet the times that we are part of. The question is not why we are here, but how we show up most powerfully to meet the times that we are part of." Now, in response to the terror attacks of Hamas on Israel, and then Israel's retaliation, there have been some very ugly extremes voiced, right? There's been a narrative that's unfortunately a very familiar narrative in our country of extreme left and extreme right. And we heard, if you on social media, you may have engaged, there's been news articles about this. We heard an extreme left saying basically that what Hamas did was justified because of the colonization of Israel. And therefore, this people oppressed, the Palestinian people oppressed, they were justified in having this action. The actions of Hamas were terrorist actions. And I'm speaking that without knowing all the ins and outs, but we can say definitively, it is not okay to slaughter and massacre people like that. Like, that is not okay, right? We know that, you know that, like in your gut, right? If you see pictures, you know that is not okay. And then same from the other side, there are people who will justify Israel's retaliation, which is getting bigger and bigger. And and say Israel is totally justified in doing that because they are the chosen people and this is their place, right? This is their land. And that also isn't right. Again, we know there's like the whole land there, Israel, Palestine, is intensely complicated. And we will never, let me just say for me, I will never have full capacity, full understanding in my mind, like politically about every in and out of it. And even without having that full knowledge, I can say, it is not okay that Hamas did that, and it is not okay that Israel's retaliation is going to take all this life, right? But what we see still is there's these extremes that give voice to a justification. They play out a script in some way. So I'll speak more to the extreme left, I guess, because I'm more familiar with that voice in some ways. But this feeling that it could be justified to say what Hamas did was okay because of the colonial occupation of the land by Israel. Well, there's a valid critique of colonialism. There's a way in which the people who would be willing to say that have been blinded by, have themselves become occupied by the script, the dehumanizing script. It's interesting in the Matthew text, they're good, they're bad. Right? Even both the good and bad were invited. The very black and white script. And of course, the same thing happens on the extreme right. There's this rigidity of identity, rigidity of oppressed and oppressor. It's a rigidity that sort of denies, I argue, that denies us our human knowing, an inner spirit-based wisdom, and are therefore creative, incredibly challenging imagination, solution making, coming to the table together. This may feel like a bit of a shift, and I'll try to help make it. But we are all, in different ways at different times, some of us maybe more consciously so, some of us unconsciously so. We are all sort of actors in scripts that play upon us. Sometimes we act in ways that we're acting because that behavior's been incentivized by power structures that have been put in place that way. I mean, whiteness itself is a structure we play inside of because it has been scripted that way. We have been incentivized as white-bodied people to act in a certain way based on many things, but in some cases based on the land and money interests of the powerful class of men in the early 1700s, late 1600s in Virginia, who started creating codes that separated slaves and servants who used to be sort of part of the same class, who used to resist together the poor treatment they received from their masters. There used to be a unity, not romanticizing it, but there used to be some unity at a time between bonded people, whatever the color of their skin. And then one of the ways that whiteness was made was to separate them and to help and to create a division between them so that the resistance was less likely to happen and be less powerful. And then whites were incentivized in certain behaviors because we became protected by the powerful people with money. And so, well, we're not going to associate with the still powerless people. That script still plays out, okay? It's an extreme simplification of that script. That script still plays out, and we participate in it unconsciously often. There's another script that plays out, and it's particularly relevant to this place that we're in, the church, this sanctuary, this space of God. And it's, for me, one thing that I definitely have preached about before, and I risk being a broken record on this, but it's very important to me, and I hope to you. And it's the persistence, it's the deep persistence of a He God, the deep persistence of a He God, and our investment in that, and how we play part in that script, that if God is a man, then men are gods. And that does every single one of us a violent disservice. Sherry Mitchell puts it bluntly. She says, "The voice of the women in its purest form has been missing from the public dialogue for far too long. As a result, life has gone into disarray. The subjugation and oppression of the divine feminine is directly connected to every threat to life that we face today. When we look at the history of feminine suppression, we see that it correlates directly to the destruction of life on earth. First, men stopped listening to the voice of the women and simultaneously stopped hearing the voice of creation. Then they began attacking the wisdom held by the women through witch hunts that burned and scarred the woman's flesh. This devaluing of women led to a rise in violence against women. This was reflected in outward attacks against the body of the mother, as the flesh of the earth was simultaneously torn, burned, and raped. Now, once again, we see patriarchal men attack the rights that women have over their own bodies. All this madness is caused by the absence of the divine feminine within our societies. Again, that's Sherry Mitchell speaking of perspective. Where's my... Again, I don't believe anyone in here is a violent person, is a manipulative person, is an aggressive person. Men, I'm not saying that of you. But there's an impoverishment and a violence that is done when God has been scripted and continues to be scripted a certain way. And it takes work, conscious work that feels like you face into a deconstructing, a taking apart, and therefore it feels chaotic and disorienting and even wrong, because it is not what we have been scripted to believe. It is not what we've been scripted and our power systems have been set up to enforce. The notion of calling God she, and that's just a word, but then all that might drip from that, all that might fall from that. How might our societies be different? And it's not mere essentialism. It's not saying women are like this and men are like that, but just imagine how might it be different? How might your own life be different? I wrote a reflection in 2017, in May of 2017, about the 23rd Psalm. I'll read it first and then I want to play a song. Because the Psalm usually is read like, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. I wrote, spring is new life coming out. This is an Easter reflection, which also speaks in Pentecost, okay? Spring is new life coming out of long sealed wintered ground. Easter is life opening a closed tomb. We are in fierce season, a time when images, symbols, myths abound to encourage the impulse in us to be unbounded. I read the lectionary text assigned for this day, May 7th. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. I don't want a he God to lead me beside still waters. This is spring, this is Easter. I have a body and a mind and a story that wants to be unbound. Even though I know this text by heart, its familiarity provides little comfort. More, it feels constraining. Just because we know something by heart does not mean it is what our heart needs. The Lord is my shepherd, he is an historically obsolete vocabulary of the divine without potency to break through wintered ground or unbind many of us from the sealed tomb. With it, our access to ourselves and the divine is incomplete. With it, the divine is incomplete. I tie it to the call for public conversations on race and racism, but I'll go ahead here. Inclusive language, we've been there, done that, we say in the progressive UCC church. The New Century Hymnal Battle, that black hymnal we have, the New Century Hymnal Battle was fought, the New Century Hymnal or some middle ground won, or the Pilgrim Hymnal, which is the red-covered one, it remains. And yet, I read the 23rd Psalm, this much beloved hymn of our Judeo-Christian traditions, and I feel my disappearance. And yet this Easter we sang in my progressive church, quote, conquering sun, and I feel the exhaustion of trying to claim a place in this story, of trying to shift the story. I don't want a he God to shepherd me. I don't want a he God to make me lie down. I don't want a he God to put me in paths for his name's sake. Our faith language oozes with the he God. Try as we have to be progressive, to include women and gender-neutral language. Our vocabularies for the divine, and therefore consciousness of the divine as beyond gender remains insufficient. I hear in my Easter-hungry voice the same push toward radical inclusion that Angela Davis invokes in for race consciousness. It is not gender-neutral, race-neutral language. I hunger for not mere inclusion in the story, but radical inclusion, radical as in root, as in change the beginning, change how the story starts, how the story of who human beings are starts, the myths. It has to be more like, in the beginning, there were women whose skin was the color of earth and night. In the beginning, there was love between these women that overflowed, filling their hearts with song. And from that love, God became flesh. Now, I know for some of you, the traditional text and the he God is extremely comforting. I know that is like balm and blanket. That's okay. But become aware that it is not sufficient. And that line I think I wrote, which I think speaks most to this moment and what I'm trying to say, is that what is most familiar is not necessarily what our heart needs, right? And part of our work, I think, to Sherry's question at the beginning to us, or description, it's not why we are here, but how we show up most powerfully in the time that we are living. Part of that work is to actually look at what's familiar and ask, is this actually what our hearts need? Is this script that we're participating in actually where an abundant table is created, actually where reconciliation happens, actually where any kind of life would come into being that we know in our hearts and guts honors the humanity of people, right? It doesn't go by scripts of gender and race and religion. It doesn't, that we are willing to face into and participate in the dismantling of that, the deconstructing of those long-held narratives, because it isn't working, because the violence is abounding, because the planet is tired, because we feel it, we know it. But it's facing into that falling apart that I think is part of our call in this time. It's facing into that everything feels like it won't quite be right. Like, what if men really did start, what if you did start moving your bodies in different ways to make way for women? What if white people really did start changing our power investments so that things were sort of redistributed? What if we really did? And I don't even know, it's an imaginative labor. But what if we were to start shifting it? Along the way, we will feel like it's chaos. And I invite, so there's chaos in the dismantling when things are not what they were familiar to us. They are not the script we were given. We're playing a different role. We're acting slightly different. We can make comfort in the chaos. We can make comfort in the chaos. I leave you with, I'm going to hope this works, Bobby McFerrin's version of the 23rd Psalm. Why I'm playing this, why this is connected to it. This is one individual, Bobby McFerrin, a musician. He wrote the song, Don't Worry, Be Happy. You might know that one. Him taking this familiar psalm and reworking it, right? I don't know his own relationship to the original psalm, but to me, this itself is a practice of creating a new comfort in the midst of a chaos. So allowing for something that isn't quite working to still speak, but to rework it, to really recreate with it. So hear this, I find it very comforting. Okay. This week, I ask you, and I'll do the same myself, to do something just a little bit different. Ask a question, get up a different time, shift a thought. Doesn't have to be big. Do something a little bit different that might help you reclaim a depth of wisdom you have, to become more author of your life and our life together, because you are enough, we are enough. The question is not why we are here, but how we show up most powerfully. Most powerfully. We need to connect to a power that we haven't really yet let speak. So I invite you to find a couple teeny ways to do that in your week. Amen.